From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what's coming up. K-State's Bill Golden will cover his new report on the impacts of the local enhanced management area on irrigation water use and farm profitability in Sheridan County, where the first ever LEMA was established. That analysis indicates that this approach to groundwater conservation is succeeding at an impressive level. Bill will have the details. Also, the presenter of the 2019 Roscoe Ellis Lecture on Soil Science at K-State this week, from North Carolina State University, Deanna Osmond, on her work in the area of Watershed Nutrient Runoff Management. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee will look at a new study of coyote predation on deer populations. All that and more here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Well, just a few years back, the state of Kansas, in response to the rapid drawdown of groundwater resources, particularly in western Kansas with the Ogallala Aquifer, instituted a new policy on water use designed to reduce or slow down that drawdown through irrigation practices called Local Enhanced Management Areas, or LEMAs. And our guest now has been studying the impact of one such LEMA implemented a number of years back in northwest Kansas, and just how effective this policy and this approach has been. We're speaking with him now via phone. Bill Golden, agricultural economist, Kansas State University. And Bill, there's a ton of information in the new summary of your work that's just been posted to the agmanager.info website out of K-State, and we'll dig through the details. But remind us again exactly how the LEMA concept works, if you would.
Okay, well, the LEMA concept is basically a producer-driven conservation program. Producers within an area, voluntarily, there's no state mandate, will get together and decide that they want to reduce water use. They will decide how they want to reduce water use. They will discuss what benefits they might want from the state for doing this. And then they will apply to the state. They will come up with a report, and it's a very definite negotiation process between the local producers with the assistance and guidance of the Groundwater Management District and the state to come up with these programs. And once everybody is happy, they actually enter into the LEMA contract, and that LEMA contract goes for the duration of the period that the producers want. Okay, so it is very flexible. In the Sheridan 6 LEMA, the guys decided to reduce water use by 20% based on their historic use and continue the program for 5 years.
And the Sheridan County number 6 LEMA is the first of its kind in the state. It's really setting the tempo for this approach and therefore prompted you to want to study its impacts. Was that the purpose of this analysis, Bill?
Yes, I think it's important to both the producers in the area and the state and researchers that we understand what happens when groundwater use is reduced.
And you've been looking at this over the last 5 years since the implementation of that LEMA in Sheridan County, that area. Let's get into the details, and there's so much information here. Start with the agronomic side of it and the whole list of variables that you analyzed.
Okay, so from an agronomic standpoint, the first thing that we looked at was how did crop mix change. And what we saw is that they reduced corn acres, and while they reduced corn acres, they also reduced the amount of water that they were using on those corn acres. They decreased the irrigation of wheat. They increased the irrigation of grain sorghum. And I think those are the main points.
When you say that the decline in corn acreage resulted in a decrease in water usage, was that a significant drop-off then?
Yes, they reduced water use over 20% on the corn acres.
Which makes sense because corn is known as a thirsty crop.
Yes.
The overall irrigated groundwater use came down, did it not, canvassing the entire spectrum of crops here?
Yes. In fact, the area, what we like to do is they had to reduce water use 20% based on their historic use. The research is based on comparing the Lima to a 3-mile borderland of the Lima where the producers weren't required to reduce water use. And what we found was that the Lima reduced water use relative to the neighbors by nearly 18%.
So again, that was quite significant.
Yes.
Now, the other side of this is the impact on economic returns to producers, which, of course, is of tremendous interest to those participating in this local enhanced management area. How did you get at those, Bill?
Okay, that's interesting. This report provides self-reported data from the producers. The metric we used was cash flow. Basically what that is revenue less variable expenses. It does not include land rent, nor does it include equipment payments. So we're trying to get everybody down on equal level, and we reported those data, and it actually looks from their data like the weighted average cash flow inside the Lima was greater than the weighted average cash flow for corn outside the Lima. Which
is really interesting, if not surprising, Bill.
Well, it is interesting, and it is surprising. And when you talk to the producers and say, how can you all do this? And what we see is they have reduced fertilizer, they have reduced seeding rates, and they have increased what I will call management. And increasing management is hard to get a handle on. But when I talk to these guys, what they tell me is, Bill, where we used to water if we thought the crop needed water, today we look ahead 4 or 5 days and say, is it going to rain or is it not going to rain? And if we think it's going to rain, we don't water.
Instead of simply defaulting to irrigation, if in
correct.
doubt. And this is something that we see the cash flow trend across crops other than corn then?
Yes, we don't have near as many observations on the other crops, okay, but we see the same trend across other crops. Eric, we can't, I wish we could, but we can't say that those numbers are statistically significant. We're capturing probably 20% of the acreage within the Lima, and these data are self-reported by the producers.
Nonetheless, it's an indicator that's valuable to observe.
It is, and so my default position is on this, guys, this is the end of the 5-year study, or the original 5-year Lima, and the producers within the Lima had the option of dropping out of the Lima this year, but they elected to re-up the Lima for another 5 years.
So the participants are pleased with how this is operating. That's the message there. And we do need to mention in your summary, you do refer to the hydrologic response to the Lima's presence here. There's a number there that really says volumes about the impact on, in this case, the Ogallala drawdown in that Lima area.
Yes. We talk about the economics and we talk about the agronomic shifts, but the hydrology is amazing, and those data came from the Kansas Geological Survey. But the decline rate has dropped from 2 feet a year to less than half a foot a year. That is pretty staggering. And they have also shown that the water that the producers are saving is staying under their property. And that's important to producers, for them to realize that whatever they save today, they get to use at some point in time in the future.
But again, to repeat, that decline rate within the Lima going from about 2 feet per year to about 5 inches per year over the 5 years of the study, 2013 through 2017. Correct. Bill, when you look at this collectively, one takes from it that this is a ringing endorsement of the Lima approach to water conservation.
It is. There's no two ways about it. I mean, what this has shown is that producers can reduce water use, they can slow the decline of the aquifer, and they can do this and still make healthy profits. In
fact, to the point that you will be studying this one more year, you tell us, Bill.
Yes. It's kind of humorous. After this final report came out, the state asked me to do it one more year. I don't do the hydrology, but I would like to see the hydrology portion of it expanded, and I'm going to try to get the Kansas Geological Survey to do that. One thing that we're missing in this study, and it's difficult data to get, is individual producer yield data. And we have approached RMA, and right now they're very positive that they will give me the yield data, the history of the yield data, both inside the Lima and outside the Lima, so that we can compare that. One of the things that we want to do with that yield data is look at the risk, the variability of yields, and see if reducing water use also reduces the risk of production.
Well, we'll look for those additional data points potentially coming together. You have posted the report on the agmanager.info website, and Bill would encourage anybody with an interest or a stake in this topic to have a look at it.
Correct. It's on Ag Manager. I think all the previous reports on Ag Manager, so you can look at how things have changed over the years. But anyway, the studying the Lima area has proved very educational.
And you're looking for the title, Monitoring the Impacts of Sheridan County 6 Local Enhanced Management Area. Bill, this is great work. Good luck in furthering it more, at least this next year. We appreciate your time right here.
You bet. Y'all have a nice day now.
You as well. Bill Golden with us via phone, agricultural economist for Kansas State University. You're listening to Agriculture Today. More shortly on the K-State Radio Network. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. The Department of Agronomy at Kansas State University has once more welcomed in an esteemed scientist in the field of agronomy to present what is the 37th annual Roscoe Ellis Jr. Lectureship in Soil Science. Now, that lecture series honors the longtime soil scientist who spent over 30 years instructing students here at Kansas State, Roscoe Ellis. Well, joining us now is an individual who is out of North Carolina State University, and she is a soil scientist by trade. Welcoming in and welcoming back to Kansas, Deanna Osmond. Deanna, you are a native Kansan, so glad to have you back in your home state.
Thank you so much, Eric, for letting me be here today.
Tell us more about your path. You did graduate from K-State and then went on to your pursuits in this area, right?
That's right. So I started in my college career at different universities, not Kansas State. I was at Wichita State University. I was really interested in becoming an anthropologist, and I had an amazing professor that said I needed an additional tool if I was going to be an anthropologist. And so I was talking to my dad, who had grown up on a farm here in Kansas, and he said, "What about agronomy?" I said, "What's agronomy?" And he proceeded to tell me. I came and visited Kansas State, and then I transferred to Kansas State, where I continued with my anthropology degree, but I also got my agronomy degree.
Then you took up an interest along the way in soil nutrients and crop nutrient management.
Yes, when I was at Kansas State, I had a crop science class and I had a soil science class. and I had to choose whether I was more interested in soils or crops. And I loved the soils classes. And so as a consequence, I got very interested in soil fertility because it was really the intersection of soils and crops. And that's why I proceeded into soil nutrient management work.
Eventually then landing at North Carolina State University.
I did indeed. I worked for a group at NC State. It was called the Water Quality Group. It was within the Department of Bio and Ag Engineering, and they looked at the relationship between conservation practices and water quality, but they did it nationally. And then a position came open in the Soil Science Department for a water quality specialist who worked in nutrient management, and I fortunately was able to get that position.
You've been at that for how long then?
Few years. I started my tenure track position in 1997, so I think that puts me at about 22, 23 years.
Tell about the kinds of things that you've zeroed in on in your work then. And watershed nutrient management encompasses quite a few things, or can. So what's been your specific interest in your scope of your work?
So when people ask me to say what I do, I say I work at the interface of nutrient management, conservation practices, and water quality. I'm really interested in how those things intersect. And so the first thing I wanted to tackle was the effectiveness of riparian buffers. North Carolina has lots and lots of streams. We're also in a humid rainfall area. Many of our streams have trees next to them. They have riparian buffers, but not all of our streams. And I was also interested in, do you actually have to have a tree next to a stream to get processing of nutrients? Can you have just shrub vegetation? Can you have switchgrass? And so one of the first things I did was I looked at the effectiveness of riparian buffers. And we looked at different vegetative types, everything from trees to switchgrass to fescue to native. And what we found is vegetation doesn't really make a difference. What's really important is the soils and processing the nitrate that's moving through the soils and changing it into a harmless gas and reducing nitrogen that's going to the streams. So that was one of my first efforts.
So soils more so than the density of the plant material itself?
Absolutely. If you have annual plants like just herbs and things like that, they will not recycle the nutrients well, or they'll return the nutrients back into the soil. The trees don't really take up that many nutrients, so it's really the processing of the nitrogen in the soil through the microbiological community that does the transformations.
So can that process be managed to accelerate the absorption of nutrients before they reach the water?
So, yeah, there are ways to do that. They have developed bioretention zones where they take drainage waters from drain tiles and they put it into these bioretention zones that are saturated. They're full of carbon, so the microbial community likes a lot of carbon. It needs the carbon to process the nitrogen, and they're able to see very good reduction of nitrate nitrogen based on having really wet conditions and carbon in these bioretention zones. So there are ways to manage it. Talking about a riparian buffer that's natural, it gets a little more difficult.
So there are still challenges, it sounds.
There are lots of challenges, yeah. But the most important thing is to try and use nutrient management in a way that really minimizes the nitrogen losses from the agricultural fields to begin with. The first thing we always tell folks is stop the pollution before it ever gets started.
And techniques such as conservation tillage presumably would be one of the starting points?
So it depends on the agricultural system, and it depends on the nutrient of concern. So oftentimes with conservation tillage, which is a wonderful tool because it can reduce sediment losses, it can also increase nitrate leaching through the soil profile and into the drain tiles or into the shallow groundwater. So at the same time that it's reducing sediment losses, it may actually be increasing nitrate losses. One of the things that's really tricky about conservation practices and water quality is they oftentimes are antagonistic towards each other. So you may be reducing sediment and phosphorus and increasing nitrate. or vice versa. Or for phosphorus with conservation tillage, you may be reducing the phosphorus that's tied to the soil. So if you stop soil erosion, you're reducing that pathway. But I just reviewed a paper. It's a meta-analysis of phosphorus and conservation tillage, and you're actually increasing soluble phosphorus going off the field. So trying to reduce nutrient pollution from agriculture is very complex, and it's also highly dependent on the agricultural cropping system.
So does the accent need to be even more on application reductions or precision applications? What are the next answers?
Absolutely. So in the state that I'm from, North Carolina, we have a lot of phosphorus, not because we had it naturally, just because we've put a lot of phosphorus on our soils. And many of our soils have so much phosphorus that actually our farmers could stop putting phosphorus on. We've got studies that show that there's really no difference in yield if they stop applying phosphorus. And so if we weren't applying the phosphorus fertilizer, we could reduce at some level the amount of phosphorus leaving the fields. So it really has to be focused, as you mentioned, on precision application of nutrients. The other thing we talk about a lot, and I'm sure you've talked about it on your show a lot, are the 4 R's, right? The right place, the right timing, the right rate, and the right source.
And those principles apply whether you're in North Carolina or in the state of Kansas.
They do. They do, indeed.
So where can the most immediate headway be made in this area, do you think, Deanna?
So there are different ways to talk about this. One is at the field scale, and then one is at the watershed scale. And those are very different propositions. So you have to at least start in the field scale. So it's thinking very clearly about trying to reduce your nutrients, so not putting them on when you don't need them, putting them on when you do need them, so minimizing that. Then having a series of conservation practices. So you've reduced it at the source by reducing your nutrient. Then you want to control it during transport. So something like a terrace might be called for depending on what you're doing, or maybe conservation tillage. And then reducing it at the water resource, so riparian buffers. So we talk about systems of conservation practices, and it's really important. And you also need to build redundancy into those systems. So that's the first thing at the field scale. But then as we think in a watershed scale, it becomes even more complex than what I've just discussed.
But as you look back over your 25 years in this field, progress has been made, has it not?
Some progress has been made. We do have some examples where we can see a water quality change because of conservation practice adoption. Sometimes we cannot see changes because there's so much pollution in the water resource that it just takes years, if not decades, to move that pollution out, particularly for something like phosphorus. But we're slowly moving, I think, to doing a better job of reducing our nutrients.
Need to keep after the cause, though.
Absolutely, keep after the cause.
It's good to have you here on the K-State campus, and good luck with your lecture coming up later today. Deanna, thank you for coming over.
Great. Thank you very much.
She's presenting the 2019 Roscoe Ellis Jr. Lectureship in Soil Science, and she'll be talking about watershed nutrient management to preserve water quality. She is Deanna Osmond, and she is from North Carolina State University, and again a soil nutrient specialist with NCSU. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll be back shortly on the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now for you today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA's National Agricultural Statistics Service reads like this. Our topsoil moisture supplies are at 35% surplus as of this past Sunday, 64% adequate, only 1% short to very short, and subsoil moisture 27% surplus, 72% adequate, and only 1% short to very short. The condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop this week, 52% good to excellent, 37% fair, and 11% poor to very poor. Well, farmers who lost grain in bin during the historic floods in Nebraska won't see any kind of indemnity unless Congress includes it in a disaster package. More details about federal resources for flood victims are coming available as farmers and residents along the Missouri River Basin wait for the waters to recede to fully assess the damages. The Army Corps of Engineers reported yesterday that levees along the Missouri and Platte rivers have breaches in 54 locations. Roughly 350 miles of levees on the Missouri, Platte, and Elkhorn rivers face extensive damage. The Gavin's Point Dam in South Dakota will increase its releases from 24,000 cubic feet per second back to 30,000 cubic feet per second as the snowpack continues to melt in North and South Dakota. Those releases at 30,000 cubic feet could continue into April. Nebraska agricultural leaders met yesterday afternoon with Greg Eibach, the USDA Undersecretary of Marketing and Regulatory Affairs. He's formerly Nebraska's longtime agriculture secretary. Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts also highlighted the flood relief efforts. That meeting went into a lot of detail about the infrastructure challenges for the livestock and ethanol industries and direct disaster aid for livestock producers. Now, one of the problems highlighted during that meeting is that grain producers may have to rely on loans because the USDA does not have an indemnity or disaster program expressly for grain farmers who lost inventory on their farms. Eibach says that Congress needs to know those aren't covered by any current USDA programs, saying perhaps it's something that Congress will want to address. The flood damage has resulted in significant grain losses for farmers with corn or beans in storage. Just in Fremont County, Iowa alone, farmers estimate they lost more than 390,000 bushels of just soybeans. Total crop losses there of roughly $7.3 million, according to the Iowa Soybean Association. Now, Congress was already trying to pass a disaster package deal with agricultural losses from the hurricanes Florence and Michael last fall. They've already indicated they would like to add the assistance for Midwest farmers into that disaster bill. The USDA has an emergency loan program with up to $500,000 to help farmers recover from the production and the physical losses. That loan program is, of course, triggered by the federal disaster declaration, and President Trump has done so for Iowa and Nebraska. Officials in Missouri have declared a disaster for multiple Missouri River counties, but so far the federal disaster has not been approved for those areas in Missouri as of yet. And livestock losses because of the flooding may qualify for the USDA's livestock indemnity program that would pay producers for up to 75% of their market losses, available for beef and dairy cattle, hogs, poultry, other forms of livestock. Right now, the volume of cattle losses in Nebraska is unclear. It was initially pegged at $400 million. There are questions about how to show documentation for lost cattle, particularly calves that may not have been tagged or recorded. Eibach said the USDA would be flexible with paperwork for producers, including using preg checks, bank statements, or other documents to show the cattle value on a ranch or a feed yard. And the Emergency Conservation Program has been opened up, allowing access to funds to prepare for fencing or removing debris from various fields. The Nebraska National Guard, incidentally, has been airdropping bales of hay to livestock in that state. On we go now to this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning forage supplies as we move into the spring and early summer. As we come out of winter, likely we've fed a lot more forage maybe than what we planned on due to the amount of moisture and the amount of cold and just the length that we've had to put up with lower temperatures, and that generally increases the amount of feed that we need to utilize with our herds. So I'd encourage you that now might be a good time to just take a walk around the feed storage area and really take close inventory of what you actually have left on hand. As you look at that, some things that I really want you to pay attention to is the amount of corn silage that you have left in storage, the amount that you're actually currently feeding each day, and then how many days is that going to stretch, and will you make it to the next corn silage harvest? You know, corn silage is one of those things that's really difficult to replace in the diet. We can supplement with some other things like wet corn gluten feed, for example, to replace part of it, but we really need enough corn silage to carry into the next harvest season. And as you look at that, you'd really like to carry past November or maybe even past the 1st of December. So look very carefully at your current inventory of corn silages. Some ways that we can conserve on that. Corn silage is a very effective feed in our lactating diets, and we really should conserve as much as we can for the lactating cows. If we're feeding corn silage to other animals, such as heifers or dry cows, we might want to consider if we have some other forages that we could replace some of that corn silage, if not all of it, that is going to those types of animals, conserving our corn silage for our lactating herd. Some other things to consider. If we get the right weather here in the next couple of weeks, you might have the opportunity to plant some oats, and that could be harvested possibly for a forage crop, probably as a silage, as you would be able to take that off quicker than if you wait and try to harvest it as a hay crop. This may help stretch your wet feeds and could be a replacement for some of the corn silage as long as you harvest it before it reaches the boot stage. Once those heads emerge, our quality drops quickly and does not usually work very well as a replacement for corn silage. Might be a supplemental forage, but not a replacement for corn silage in your lactating diets. Another thing to consider is whether or not you could harvest some small grains that are already growing out there in the field as a silage crop, again, to stretch your corn silage supplies so that you can ensure that you will make it to the next harvest season without running out. Again, running out of corn silage in the middle of the summer is not a very good plan for a dairy farm where we're concerned about milk flow with our lactating cows. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a careful look at the forage supplies that they have on hand, making plans to make it to the next corn silage harvest.
All right, Mike, many thanks. And we'll return shortly with more here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and coming up now, this week's Wildlife Management segment with Charlie Lee, Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, your comments today will draw from a new study of the impact of coyotes on deer populations, and what's been known to date about this?
Well, we've always known that predators and prey populations are linked. There's certainly been a lot of controversy. Does the number of predators control the number of prey? Does the number of prey and abundance of prey control the number of predators? And I'm not sure that we'll ever get a consistent answer to either one of those because there are a lot of other variables. We do know that coyotes are predators. Primarily, coyotes were thought to be native in the Great Plains and the southwestern part of the United States. Now they've expanded their range into eastern North America, where they're now the largest predator, and they prey on white-tailed deer. Consequently, by preying on white-tailed deer, you get the conflict between those people that want to have every deer, thinking that every deer is going to be a trophy animal, and they want to remove all of the limiting factors of which predation may be a part. White-tailed deer fawn mortality from coyotes has been shown to reach over 80% of all of the mortalities out there in some locations. We do know that when coyotes have reached some of the more eastern states, that food habit studies from coyotes have shown a considerable amount of deer in their diets, and even some coyote removal experiments in the eastern United States have shown deer recruitment can increase 2 to 3 times following coyote removal. But that was only one study. All of the other studies that looked at removal of coyotes had little or no effect on deer populations, especially several years after the removal was stopped. So when people talk about removal of 1 or 2 individuals out of a coyote population is probably not going to impact deer numbers in any great way. Now, if you could remove coyotes at a high enough rate of removal for a long enough period of time, I think you could definitely see some changes. But that's probably going to be more intense than anyone is going to be able to implement. This recent article published in the Journal of Wildlife Management looked at the effects on white-tailed deer following eastern coyote colonization.
And this was a highly comprehensive study, was it not? You say it canvassed multiple states over a long stretch of time?
Yes, it was 35 years of data for 384 counties. 6 states included Florida, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and South Carolina, and was completed in 2014 and began in 1981. They looked at existing deer populations, and they used hunter-harvest of deer as an index for deer populations. The data is pretty clear on when coyotes moved into some of those states, and it's been fairly recent. Coyotes colonized New York and Ohio first. That would have been in the 1940s to 1970, but some counties in North Carolina weren't colonized until the 2000s. Coyote populations in Florida were probably initiated prior to 2000, but coyotes were deliberately introduced into Florida as a means of fox hunting in pens, only they were used coyotes instead of red fox. So it was a wide range of climate, wide range of land cover use. So I think it was a pretty wide-ranging project, and it looked at the big picture rather than deer numbers on small areas.
What does the big picture say then? Is there, in fact, a dramatic impact of coyote predation on deer populations?
Well, their summary showed that deer populations in all of the states that they studied experienced a positive population growth following the arrival of coyotes. At the time since the coyotes arrived was not a significant predictor in any deer population models, and their results indicate that coyotes are not controlling deer populations on any large spatial scale in the eastern North America. But sometimes when I look at deer hunting magazines, people are focused on 1 or 2 individual small area trials that show an impact and extrapolate that into the big picture. And this study at least showed that when you look at it on the large scale, coyotes are not controlling deer numbers in the eastern part of the United States.
And that has a great lot to do with the habitat, you say. Coyotes' preference for more open areas as compared to deer, which like the more woody areas.
Well, the study showed that predation was less on fawns in areas that had more diverse types of habitat cover. In the areas that had heterogeneity or a mix of habitat types, fawns were able to hide better in cover and avoid coyote predation. Didn't seem to be any impact on elevation or any impact when they looked at coyote numbers over climate ranges. One big difference is that most of the eastern United States is much more wooded than what we would have here. Forest covered about 34% of the study area. That's quite different than what we would have here in the Great Plains. But the results still showed that coyotes as a predation event are not controlling white-tailed deer populations in the eastern part of the United States on a large scale.
Which then means that coyote control will have a minimal impact, by and large, on deer numbers.
Unless you control coyote numbers on a large scale, small reductions of coyotes in small areas are not going to significantly impact white-tailed deer numbers.
Well, it's a rather revealing study out of the eastern part of the U.S., 6 states, 35 years of data looking at this question of the impacts on white-tailed deer following the colonization of coyotes in that part of the nation, and we appreciate the report, Charlie. Many thanks. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee, with us. Again, to listen to our broadcast anytime you choose, visit agtoday.net. You can listen on demand, and you can find links to subscribe to the podcast via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify. Start by going to agtoday.net. Meantime, Eric Atkinson thanking you for joining us for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.